When Luke Skywalker took Grogu from Din Djarin, the Jedi would evaluate the foundling, both of his connection to the Force, and if he was too old to become a Jedi again. With the guidance of Ahsoka Tano, Luke would attempt to train Grogu on Ossus, but he began to wonder if Grogu really wanted to be a Jedi. A visit from Din Djarin confirmed Grogu had struggles with attachment, so Luke decided to give him a choice before he advanced any further with his training. If Grogu chose the Mandalorian, he would be in breach of the Jedi Code, but if he remained, he would be the first student in the Academy and a great Jedi under Luke Skywalker, but he might never see Djarin again. Grogu ultimately chose his bond with the Mandalorians, but what if he chose the path of the Jedi? How would this affect Grogu and the new Jedi Order? Would the Mandalorians be able to defeat Moff Gideon? Luke watched as Grogu waddled from side to side, and even without the Force, he knew his attachment to the Mandalorian was waging an internal war with his Jedi teachings. After what seemed an eternity, Grogu levitated the green lightsaber into the air, and Luke declared him to be the first Jedi of his new academy. With the help of R2-D2 and the androids, Grogu was escorted to his new makeshift quarters, whilst Luke remained in the stone structure. Having seen Grogu's memories of Order 66, the Jedi wondered if he had forced Grogu into his decision, and his reason for choosing the Jedi was for the wrong reasons. Luke was aware of what had happened to Anakin, and it had been his desire to save Padme and others that had led to his downfall, so he vowed to ensure he wouldn't make the same mistakes. As Ahsoka had told him, Luke needed to trust in his instincts, and his instincts told him that Grogu would make for a great Jedi. Luke walked out of the building, and he saw Grogu helping the androids to levitate the stone bricks, so he decided to challenge Grogu, just as Yoda had done all those years ago on Dagobah. Grogu would adopt different poses and endure the distractions of R2-D2 before Luke was satisfied with the day's training, but as the night fell, Luke sensed a disturbance from the Academy's newest student. The Master hurried to the quarters of Grogu, and he saw his student was convulsing, so he used the Force to calm him down. Luke could see the signs of a Force vision, and with the consent of Grogu, he managed to see his old homeworld of Tatooine and flickering images of pain and suffering. The Jedi had previously been guilty of acting on these visions, and as Yoda had reminded him, there was no guarantee that they held the truth. As he looked at Grogu struggling from discomfort, Luke felt as if he owed him to act on the vision, as he had just taken him away from someone who had adopted him. Whilst the New Republic considered Tatooine as part of its territory, Luke knew that the planet was largely governing itself, and he would have to be cautious if they were to directly interfere. Without wasting any more time, Luke took Grogu into his X-Wing, but instructed him to not leave the ship, both to keep him safe and to also test if he could let go of his bond to Din Djarin. When the Jedi landed on Tatooine, Luke left Grogu in the hands of Peli Motto, whilst he put his hood over his head and covertly moved around Mos Eisley to acquire a speeder. Around the perimeter of Mos Eisley's Chalmun Cantina, Luke would spot several Pike guards exchanging spice, and after overhearing their plans in Mos Espa, he subtly used the Force to knock them out. To anyone passing through the cantina, such behaviour was normal, and Luke was able to take one of the Pike's land speeders to venture out of Mos Eisley. Using his vast knowledge of the planet, Luke reached the outskirts of the civilization of Mos Espa when he sensed an echo in the Force. The Jedi abandoned the speeder in a corner of the exterior fencing of the town and utilised a Force-enhanced leap to jump onto the roof of one of the homes. Surveying the area from a height, Luke quickly distinguished the Duros bounty hunter Cad Bane, and standing opposite him were Fennec Shand and the survivor of the Sarlacc Boba Fett. As the Daimyo and Shan retreated to the ruins of Gorsa's sanctuary, Luke masked his presence with the Force and moved from rooftop to rooftop until he felt the echo return. As Luke felt the battle was yet to begin, he dropped down from the roof and ducked into the building he had stood on top of, and immediately he was hit by the echo of Anakin Skywalker. Memories of building C-3PO, interactions with Shmi, and accidental uses of the Force rushed back to Luke and caused him to stumble out of the door. Luke's reverie was disturbed by mechanical clicking from nearby, and he saw the Pikes readying a 4th degree Scorponek droid. Before the Pike sensed its presence, Luke returned to his previous location, and before the deflector shield generator was activated, he controlled the direction of the twin laser cannons and focused them onto the pike foot soldiers. Luke saw Boba Fett trying to prevent the town from any further damage, so he turned the Scorpionet droid away from the pikes and onto the second droid of its kind as well as the Trandoshans. Whilst Luke had swung the battle in favour of Boba Fett and Din Djarin, he sensed that there was something else on Tatooine, so he leapt off of Anakin's old hut and jumped back onto his speeder. As the sound of the celebration from the mods and the grunt of protest from the pikes both receded into Tatooine's sands, the Force guided him back towards Mos Eisley. The echo of Anakin returned to Luke, so he brushed his hand across the scorched surface and discovered what had happened to the Tusken Raiders, from their capture of Shmi to Anakin's Darkside massacre. Luke would have been surprised had he not known what Anakin had become, but what definitely surprised him was the ghost of Anakin standing behind him. Even as a projection in the Force, Luke saw remorse in the ghost, but rather than blaming him for what had happened, he asked Anakin how he should train Grogu. Anakin pointed to the evidence of his massacre, then wisely told Luke to look at how the Jedi had failed, and instead of correcting their mistakes, he should take his own path. As Anakin's ghost faded into the sands, Luke was skeptical of what Anakin had told him. His Jedi teachings had told him the dangers of attachment, and here was a Jedi who had fallen because of the rule, implying that he should now be accepted. Just as Luke was about to get into his speeder, he was interrupted by a sound overhead, and he looked to find his own X-Wing hovering above him. Luke shook his head as Grogu peered into view, and the Jedi realised that he must now follow Anakin's advice and travel to Jabba's palace. When Luke entered the hidden hangar of Jabba's palace, Din Djarin was preparing to leave in his customised M1 starfighter, and the Mandalorian turned to see Luke, R2-D2 and Grogu. Djarin knew that with his own desire to redeem himself by bathing in the living waters of Mandalore, the visits to Grogu would be limited, but he knew that he needed someone to teach him to control the Force. Leaving Djarin to his mission, Luke and Grogu returned to Ossus and his training would resume. Having spent several decades hardly using the Force, Grogu was trained in the control, sense and alter abilities again, but more importantly his discipline, and this enabled him to wield an initiate's training lightsaber. Whilst Grogu was progressing in his training, Din Djarin was making equally good progress with his own mission. With the knowledge that Grogu would be safe, Djarin could focus on his own mission to become a Mandalorian again, and had travelled to Nevarro. High Magistrate Karga was skeptical about Djarin's plans to revive IG-11, and without Grogu, he struggled to find any ideas to rebuild the droid, especially with the damaged memory circuit. Given the loyalty and sacrifice made by IG-11, the Mandalorian wasn't going to give up so easily, so he made a return to the Adelphi base. Djarin found Captain Carson Tava at his usual spot in the outpost, and the pilot directed him to the world of Mechis 3, which was located on the Corellian trade route. The world that had once belonged to the Techno Union was almost devoid of life, except for a few brave scavengers and salvage droids, and the Mandalorian was as out of place here as he had been on Nevarro. His experience with battle droids in the Clone War had made Djarin hate droids, but having seen IG-11, his surroundings on Mechis 3 gave him an idea. R5-D4 surveyed the abandoned factories and shipyards, and it found a nearby IG assassin droid factory that had closed after the Clone War. Djarin easily found the memory circuit he was looking for, and with any other parts that looked useful, he returned to Nevarro and helped the Anzellan droidsmiths. What they had created was an upgrade on IG-11, and Djarin was now ready to become a Mandalorian again. Travelling to the world of Kelevara, the Mandalorian stepped into the castle of Clan Kryze and approached the disheartened Bo-Katan. Djarin announced that he had found an entire sleeping army on Mechis 3, and with the Darksaber in his possession, it was up to him to take over Mandalore. Bo-Katan looked at Djarin with amusement, but she wouldn't deny him the chance to redeem her own failure. The former owner of the Darksaber ushered her success out of her castle, and Djarin travelled to the abandoned Mandalore. When he approached the planet, both the folded IG-12 and R5-D4 were beeping furiously as they sensed their magnetic fields being disturbed. During the Great Purge of Mandalore, the Empire had sent a message to Bo-Katan and the Mandalorians, annihilating everything in its path. The main culprits have been the TIE surface assault bombers, which are primarily tasked with leading attacks on buildings. With their uniquely designed dual pods, they were able to both carry the pilot and have a spare chamber for munitions, from concussion missiles to proton torpedoes, but on the night of 1,000 tears, they carried fusion bombs. Such was the effect of these fusion bombs, they turned the surface into a murky green material known as trinitite, but they also interrupted the magnetic field in the atmosphere. As a result, Djarin now found himself annoyed by his two droids, so when he landed on the scorched surface, he dispatched them to test the atmosphere. Whilst he waited for the droids, the Mandalorian felt uncomfortable at the silence, and he also couldn't shake the feeling that he needed Grogu for this mission. With the help of IG-12, R5-D4 was able to negotiate the sentient Alamites, and rolled back to the ship. The astromech confirmed what Bo-Katan had told him, and there was no curse on Mandalore. Stepping outside of the comfort of his M1 starfighter, Djarin cautiously stepped foot on the surface, and with his IB-94 blaster pistol in hand, he scoured the cave from side to side. The victims of IG-12 were scattered across the floor, but when Djarin approached the remains of the Civic Center, he would now be alone. The abandoned city was silent, apart from the jetpack of the Mandalorian, who descended to the bottom of the area. As the water dripped from the eroding pipes, Djarin could barely see more than a meter in front of him, his only light source being a small helmet light. He would soon notice the surface of the floor change, from the remains and debris of the battle to a fine ash-like substance, and in amongst it would be an old Mandalorian helmet. Djarin dug down and brushed off the dust to gaze the helmet, but with his vision limited and the audio sensors in his helmet distorted, he was taken by surprise when a spider tank leapt from the ground. The droid used one of its mechanical limbs to snatch the Mandalorian, and after a struggle, the scavenger droid within the tank placed Djarin in a cage. Desperately trying to find a signal through his helmet, the magnetic interference was blocking all of his attempts, and one by one, his armor was being removed. Blood started to drip from his skin as the droid snatched its claws across him, and Djarin's life was starting to fade. Back on the surface, IG-12 was conversing in droid speak with R5-D4, and the assassin droid was beginning to question the decision of his master to go alone. The sight of the drop below had triggered a threat warning in IG-12, but his new programming to care for Djarin was fighting his original role of an assassin. Against the furious R5-D4, IG-12 took a leap of faith. The mechanical limbs clattered into every pipe and framework on its way down, until the droid grasped a girder about halfway down from its destination. Even with its damage-resistant armor, the fall had dented and wounded the droid, but IG-12 cleverly used his utility belt to fix the dents, before falling for a final time. Thanks to the water softening the ground, IG-12 was able to survive the final impact, and as the assassin droid made minor repairs, his sensors alerted him. A number of heat signatures flashed across its vision, and as it took a step into new terrain, IG-12 saw Djarin in a cage. With a plasma cutter in its claw, IG-12 cut through the metal bars of the cage, and the Mandalorian soon dropped to the floor. IG-12 used some of its Bacta spray to heal his wounds, but soon the cyborg returned. The assassin droid switched from caring to lethal in a flash, and with two blaster rifles, he tried to fire the cyborg into dust. The cyborg's armor and agility made it a difficult target, so IG-12 moved swiftly to pick up the fallen Darksaber, then violently dissected the cyborg. As the circuitry of the cyborg fizzled out, IG-12 collected the fallen Beskar armor of his master and placed it back onto him. Having heard about Djarin's mission to redeem himself, IG-12 tried to use its sensors to scan for any water, but it was too far away. If he wanted to help with his master's mission, he would have to do it the human way. IG-12 had little knowledge of what the mines looked like, so did what he was programmed to do, and waited for his master to awaken. As the night settled on the outside, the battered and bruised Djarin stuttered into life. The Mandalorian thanked IG-12 for saving his life, but he also had no clue how to get to the mines. To complete his mission, they decided they had no other choice but to blast their way to the mines. With a combination of whistling birds and detonators, the already ruined civic centres reduced into more dust, but they managed to create gaps in the ceiling to improve visibility. After the night had passed and dawn broke through the cracks, Djarin and his droid finally spotted an entrance. A tall structure with a distinct gap through the middle brought hope to the weakened Mandalorian, and his redemption was within reach. The duo entered the narrow opening, and they walked through the cave, the light disappearing with every step, until they were left with Djarin's helmet light again. But before they lost hope again, the Mandalorian found what he had been looking for. With a sprint that defied his lack of energy, he walked through a trapezoidal archway to find the living waters. IG-12 immediately asked his master to stop, and as the assassin droid walked forward, its sensors detected something sentient was in the water. Djarin walked to the sign next to the shore, and it said that Mandalore the Great had been able to defeat and tame the mythosaur. As he turned back to look at the water, the Mandalorian knew that his mission had become more than just becoming a redeemed Mandalorian. Djarin paced the perimeter of the water, wondering if the legend of the mythosaur was really true, and how the Mandalorians ever tamed such a beast. In a moment of realization, Djarin and IG-12 had the same idea, and wielding their detonators, they knew their best chance was to summon the monster. The detonators were thrown both into the water, and the wall at the back of the cave, and the area started to crumble. Djarin and IG-12 retreated to the archway, as debris fell around them until all fell silent. The Mandalorian took cautious steps back to the water when he was greeted by an almighty roar that shook the already damaged cavern to its foundations. Igniting his darksaber, Djarin moved to slice the rising mythosaur to pieces, but at the sight of his weapon, the roar became a low growl. IG-12 kept his blasters equipped whilst Djarin slowly approached the 50-foot beast and took steps into the water. He swore on his name and those of the ancestors that he would walk the way of the Mandalore, and the words of the creed would be forged into his heart. Removing a small cylinder from his belt, he took a sample of the living waters as proof for when he returned to the covert, and he looked at the scales of the mythosaur's sternum. Against the advice of IG-12, the redeemed Mandalorian used his jetpack and climbed onto the back of the mythosaur. The reluctant assassin droid was dragged to the mount of the mythosaur, and the once dormant beast saw light again. The Mandalorian had grown up hearing about the legend of the Torm and the conquest of Mandalore the First, and he now followed in their footsteps. The roof collapsed into the waters as the trio bulldozed and climbed their way back to the surface, and Djarin decided to shelter the mythosaur in a nearby cave surrounded by trinitite. With R5-D4 returning to the surface, Djarin folded IG-12 and together they travelled out of Mandalore and back to the covert. The M1 starfighter touched down onto the shore, and Djarin emerged alone to face Paz Vizsla. The skeptical Mandalorian claimed Djarin was an apostate, but the Redeemer was prepared, and with the cylinder he had retrieved, he is led to the armourer. Unscrewing the lid, the droplets of the living waters turned a bold blue, and Djarin had achieved his first mission of becoming a Mandalorian again. Igniting his darksaber, he held it aloft and claimed that he wanted to take over Mandalore. Murmurs of mixed approval echoed in the armory, and Vizsla doubted if Djarin had the resources, given their previous failure in the Night of 1,000 Tears. Reaching into his pocket, he showed them the scale of the mythosaur and guided them outside to his ship, where he summoned R5-D4. The astromech activated its holoprojector and showed the Mandalorians the army on Mechis 3, and finally the Mandalorians had been convinced. It was time to take over Mandalore again. As the Mandalorian tribe at their covert prepared for their attack, events were much less dramatic, rather more devious on the other side of the galaxy. Within the unknown regions was the planet of Exegol, and its past history as a vibrant planet was now forgotten by almost everyone. The desert planet had become a story of Sith legends, with the likes of Darth Noctis and Darth Sanguis searching for immortality. By the time of the Galactic Empire, Exegol will be visited by the latest Sith Darth Sidious, and the Sith Lord began to experiment with cloning and plan for life after death. With Sidious falling at the Battle of Endor, his transition to another body was not a smooth one, and one that was filled with pain. Even though Sidious was physically weak, and forced to wear an Omen harness to help him stand, the dark side energy from Exegol at least ensured his mind was intact. In the Sith Citadel was a laboratory, where both his past and present body had guided the Sith Eternal, and one of his first attempts, named Snoke, was currently acting his plans in the galaxy. Alongside the roots of the First Order, the hidden Sith had been watching the young Ben Solo since his birth 5 years ago, Even from such a remote planet as Exegol, Sidious had been able to plant dark visions in Ben's mind, but he had recently sensed a shift in the Force. Sidious had been tracking his old foe Luke Skywalker, and though his weakened body couldn't influence the Jedi Master, he noticed that he had a new student. The Sith Lord's harness started to shake as Grogu brought up visions of another Jedi Yoda. Memories of deceiving Yoda during the Clone War sent cackles across his throne room, but the Grand Master had also been partially responsible for Luke's intervention on the Death Star. The bones in the shoulders of the decrepit Sith clicked as he rubbed his hand in glee, and he saw his chance for revenge against one of Yoda's rare species. On the world of Ossus, Grogu had almost learnt everything he had been taught before Order 66, but without Din Djarin, Grogu started to feel lonely. Luke would often leave him to meditate, and after several weeks, he would find a voice in his mind. The Jedi Initiate heard the voice telling him to unlock his true power, and trying to turn him against Luke, but Grogu showed resistance. In spite of his young age for his species, Grogu could distinguish his mind from the dark tendrils of the Sith, and he soon reached out to Luke. Whilst the Jedi considered the threat of the darkness, two Sith were most displeased with his show of resistance. Darth Sidious had clearly underestimated Grogu and secretly passed this message on to Snoke, who was then influenced to take a different approach. Reverting to his original target of Ben Solo, Snoke decided on a two-pronged attack. To try and get Ben and Grogu to turn to the dark side, he began to tell Ben to move away from both Leia and Han, and Leia would soon sense the darkness within the 4-year-old Ben. Within their apartment on Chandrila, Leia switched on her holoprojector and decided to tell Luke that Ben needed to be trained by the Jedi and help him to contain the growing darkness. The Jedi Master agreed to take Ben as the second student in the academy, but he couldn't help but be suspicious. He pondered if the probing into both Grogu and Ben's minds were somehow connected. Since the Battle of Endor, Luke had scoured the galaxy far and wide in pursuit of knowledge, as he tried to rebuild the Jedi Order. With the help of Lor San Tekka, Luke had visited worlds such as Gatalenta and Tython, recovered Jedi caches such as the one formerly owned by Jocasta Nu, and even found a sacred Jedi text on Ossus, known as the Ramagon, which contained early stories of the Jedi Order. But as Luke watched the Millennium Falcon flying through the clouds, then landed with a hiss onto the makeshift landing pad, Luke was concerned that he had been led to this knowledge. With Leia busy with senatorial duties on Chandrila, it is Han Solo who arrives to ask Luke to train Ben, and Grogu emerges from behind a nearby stone to find he was now not alone. Luke sensed a shift in the Force from Grogu, and much of his growing frustrations had been vanquished by Ben, so he decided that instead of focusing on gathering knowledge, he needed to find more students. Whilst Luke tended to his newest student on Ossus, Snoke and Sidious were pleased that the first part of their plan was proceeding as they had foreseen. Sidious planned for Ben and Grogu to push each other to the dark side, but he knew that the Order 66 survivor would require more to be turned. Whilst the Sith Lord was aware of the galaxy's Force sensitives, he was still monitoring other threats such as the Mandalorians. The Mandalorian resistance had been an irritating thorn in the Empire, so Sidious had been pleased by their decimation in the Night of 1,000 Tears. But 5 years on from that night, he had sensed their growing power and the influence of Din Djarin. Sidious had not followed the entire journey of the Mandalorian, but from what he had seen, he had been a threat to Moff Gideon on Navarro, and had established a close bond with Grogu. This was an opportunity he could not afford to let pass. As part of the second step in his plan, he influenced Snoke again, and anticipating an encounter on Mandalore, he dispatched Snoke to intervene. At the Mandalorian covert, Djarin and Vizsla were trying to plan to reunite Bo-Katan's abandoned followers, when R5-D4 received a transmission. A distressed Bo-Katan informs of an attack by TIE interceptors on her castle underworld of Kalevala. Convincing Paz Vizsla to organise a rescue, Djarin would also leave the recruitment of the deserted forces to many of the heavy Mandalorian warriors, whilst he returned to the planet of Mechis 3. Before his previous departure from the former Techno-Union planet, the Mandalorian had revived many of the rusting machines that had once churned out assassin droids for the Separatists. But on his return to the planet, the assassin droids served a different master. Djarin didn't have a droid control ship to control the droids, so with the help of R5-D4, he managed to override their programming and assigned IG-12 as their new leader. As he was about to leave the planet, Vizsla informed him of the covert's progress. Not only had they succeeded in rescuing Bo-Katan after the Kree's castle had been destroyed, but they had also recruited some of the deserters, such as Axe Woves. But as ever with Din Djarin, this success was too good to last. When leaving Mechis 3, Djarin decided to take 2 ships. One was his M1 starfighter with IG-12, and the other was a repaired C-9979 landing craft, which was formerly used by the Trade Federation and designed to be placed in battleships. With R5-D4 in control, Djarin ordered the droid to follow him to Mandalore, but as they navigated the network of trade routes, Djarin was met by turret fire from out of nowhere. Through his bounty hunting exploits, Djarin was normally more than capable of escaping such encounters, but it was as if the opposing pilot could read his every move. The Mandalorian barely saw the ship on his scope before his right combustion chamber was smoking, and he started to rapidly descend onto the planet below. The world was the recently conquered TIE Farer, and as Djarin spiraled through the clouds, he opted for his most desperate measure. Opening both his and IG-12's canopies, he pulled the droid out of the smouldering starfighter, and with his jetpack in place, he ejected himself out of the ship. The two landed on an abandoned spire, and they saw that somehow the M1 starfighter was mostly intact. Memories of the Razor Crest flooded back to the Mandalorian, and before he even thought about a rescue, the ship was detonated by a group of troopers, who appeared to be dressed in Imperial uniform. With no way of communicating with the Children of the Watch, he hoped that R5-D4 had at least delivered them the droids. Now without a way back, Djarin and IG-12 looked from their lofty position, and buried amongst the burnt barley fields were a series of strategically placed comm towers. The pair noticed that they led to a military base, and after avoiding the stormtroopers, they found it to be surprisingly empty, but the Mandalorian suspected a trap. Even before they could reach the hangar, a robed figure materialized in front of them, and there was nowhere to run. The Mandalorian's hand twitched towards his darksaber, but the shadowy figure was faster. Djarin's arm moved immediately to his neck, which was constricted under a force choke, until IG-12 initiated a defense sequence for his master. The assassin droid stepped in front of Djarin and fired off a series of erratic bullets, striking the floor, the ceiling and the walls. The robed figure used a combination of acrobatics and force abilities, but in their efforts, the hood was removed to reveal a wrinkly, balding man. Little did Din Djarin know that he had just faced Snoke, who had been attempting to torment Grogu. The sound of the duel had awakened the dormant base, and the rapid footsteps from around them would quickly become stormtroopers, all pointing their blasters at the Mandalorian and the droid. Djarin knew that he could not win this battle. The eyes within his helmet panned from side to side, and he saw no obvious way out. Djarin gently flexed the vambraces on his wrist, and he felt that he still had several whistling birds remaining. As the stormtroopers raised and prepared to fire, the Mandalorian flicked his wrist and sent several of the small explosives around the corridor, and ordered IG-12 to leave. The droid was reluctant to override its programming, but on Djarin's second order, IG-12 evaded the blaster shots from the stormtroopers and found a path to the hangar. As the ships exploded behind the droid, it managed to find an unscathed prototype TIE fighter and flew out of TIE Farer's First Order base. As the Mandalorian's hands were put in binders, he watched as the TIE fighter flew into the distance, and he knew that at least IG-12 would be able to get back to their tribe. Snoke ordered Djarin to be dragged into the elevator, and hidden from any of TIE Farer's inhabitants, he was taken to a detention centre and placed in a torture chair. Under the watchful and disdainful gazes of Snoke and 2 First Order officers, the new IT-000 model interrogation droid circled the Mandalorian. While Snoke had allowed Djarin to wear his helmet, he did so to mock the so-called old Mandalorian ways, and removed the rest of his armour to leave him exposed. The interrogation droid was similar to the Imperial IT-0 model, and also like a medical droid, it started to inject the Mandalorian with a truth serum. Djarin was used to such methods of torture, as Snoke continued to question what he knew of Grogu, and the dark side user ordered for more implements. In the second round of torture, the IT-000 droid used a combination of a sonic torture needle and a shock device that started to weaken the nerve endings of the Mandalorian. But despite the screams of pain, which reverberated off the walls of the room, Djarin continued to resist and Snoke decided to use the Force. The clone of Sidious intensified his focus and used a mind probe, which allowed him to access Djarin's thoughts and memories, and he saw Grogu's attachment to the Mandalorian, then his reluctance to be taken away by Luke. Snoke released his captive from the chair and ordered him to be taken away, and Djarin was dragged into one of the cells and sealed by a laser gate. During his torture, IG-12 had made its way to Mandalore, and following the route that R5-D4 had taken, the droid informs the tribe, that now included Bo-Katan, that their leader had been captured. Without Djarin, the tribe had no one to tame the mythosaur, and it was too late for them to turn back. As they looked up from their temporary base, which was located just within the entrance to the old Civic Center, it became apparent that the recent arrivals had not gone unnoticed. The squadron of TIE bombers and TIE interceptors flew in formation and unloaded their assortment of missiles on the already scarred landscape. Vizsla orders the tribe to retreat below ground as R5-D4 and IG-12 decided to leave the atmosphere of the planet, and they settled on the moon of Concordia, where the Children of the Watch had previously taken refuge. The sudden downturn in the fortunes of the Mandalorians had not gone unnoticed at the Jedi Academy on Ossus, and like his previous vision of the suffering on Tatooine, Grogu was willing to consult Luke. If the Jedi must have been concerned with the previous vision, that was nothing compared to the darkness echoing from his latest vision. Luke hadn't sensed such evil since his encounter with Darth Sidious, and all the recent events, from Leia's vision on Ajan Kloss to Grogu's vision of Tatooine, and finally the rushed arrival of Ben, all pointed to one thing: the Sith had returned. Whilst the younger Luke would have rushed into battle, this older and wiser Luke went to one of his newly constructed rooms in the academy, and with R2-D2 and a medical droid observing him, he lowered himself into a sensory deprivation tank. Luke had heard about the ritual from Yoda, who had undergone the same process during the Clone War, to communicate with Qui-Gon, and as Luke started to become one with the Force, he started to hear voices. Past Jedi such as Anakin, Obi-Wan, Yoda and Qui-Gon told him he could choose between Typhera and Mandalore, but there was no guarantee that everyone could be saved. Once the ritual was completed, Luke retreated to his quarters to rest, and as he gazed out at his new students, his mind was clear. He would travel to Typhera. Luke decided to take his students, as he feared their solitude on Ossus, and Han Solo soon arrived in the Millennium Falcon. The smuggler was not pleased to be involved in another skirmish, as he had been planning to clean his reputation now that he was married to a politician such as Leia, but he still took them towards Typhera. Han had heard suspicious activity on the planet from Leia, and these suspicions were confirmed when they were faced with a squadron of TIE fighters. Luke and Han took their positions as gunners, and with Han outmaneuvering the pilots, they descended to the planet largely unscathed. Around several hundred meters above the ground, Luke leapt from the ramp and onto a tall comm tower, and as the sound of the Falcon's engines receded into the distance, he felt a cold chill of evil shudder through his spine. The Jedi saw the military base, and the insignia that had risen in notoriety, but raising the hood of his robes above his head, he carefully evaded the stormtroopers. Several well-timed mind tricks and distractions later, Luke disguised himself in a stormtrooper uniform, just as he had done to save Leia, and after overhearing the capture of the Mandalorian, he descended to the lower levels. Luke was mistaken if he thought this would go the same way as his rescue of Leia, when he came face to face with Snoke. The dark side user sneered at the Jedi, and Luke could feel some of the darkness of Sidious within him. Snoke raised his fingers for a lightning attack, but this time Luke was prepared and raised his lightsaber to defend the attack. This was just the beginning for Snoke, and he soon switched to probing Luke's mind, but the Jedi turned the tables and called Snoke a mere shadow of a real Sith. The face of Snoke twisted into a familiar grin as Sidious started to take over, and Luke saw Snoke reaching to a black blade, so he knew he had to end the battle quickly. The Jedi raised one of his hands and pulled down some of the metal girders on the ceiling and dropped them onto the possessed Snoke. Wasting no time, Luke deactivated all the gates to the cells, and Djarin trudged out. The Mandalorian gratefully thanked Luke, and retrieving his armour from a nearby locker and his darksaber from Snoke's belt, they walked outside to find Han lighting up the base with his laser cannons. With the anti-aircraft cannons still unfinished, Luke and Djarin leapt onto the ramp of the Falcon, and Djarin informed them of the situation on Mandalore. Luke convinced Han to travel to the planet, all the while being troubled by the words echoed by the Jedi Masters. This was not helped by the lack of communication between Djarin and the Mandalorians, who he could only assume had descended close to the mines. After travelling for several days, the Falcon and its crew arrived to a quiet Mandalore. Djarin guided Han to the entrance to the Civic Centre, and in front of the cave, the mythosaur was still where he had left it. After feeding the beast with some of the alamite strewn across the cave, Djarin rode the mythosaur with Luke, and they followed a trail of debris and scorch marks across the landscape. The trio eventually spotted a discreet sinkhole-looking crevice, and Imperial commandos rose to the surface to greet them. Igniting their blades, Luke and Din Djarin attacked the commandos without fear, slicing through the weak points in their Beskar alloy armour, and the roar of the mythosaur shook the now visible hidden Imperial base. Having fought for several days, the Mandalorians had been on the brink of defeat, and it was only Bo-Katan's efforts to stall Moff Gideon and the defence of the IG-12 droid army that had prevented their downfall. The mythosaur swooped into the cavern and lashed its tail across anything it could find, and the Mandalorians were freed from their capture. As Moff Gideon emerged from the main hangar, he used his whipcord to try and tie the mythosaur, but he used his sharp teeth to rip the cord to shreds. As Luke leapt off to help any stricken Mandalorians, Gideon dived with his flamethrower ignited and headed for the mouth of the mythosaur, but he was caught in the wave of the roar. Gideon proceeded to be engulfed in his own flames and flung from side to side by the beast until he was dropped to the depths below. As Djarin looked up, he saw the Millennium Falcon and the faces of Grogu and Ben Solo looking excitedly at the chaos. Luke had successfully rescued the Mandalorians and planned to return to the academy, hoping the darkness would never touch his students again. That is it for What If Grogu Chose to Become a Jedi. If you'd like to see another What If, feel free to leave your suggestions in the comments below. Thank you for watching and see you next time.